The flashing blue lights didn't just signal a traffic stop, they signaled the end of a career. Officer Brock Reynolds thought he was untouchable, a king in a polyester uniform stalking the wrong kind of driver in a neighborhood of old money and deep secrets. He saw a black man in a $100,000 Mercedes and saw a target. He didn't see the federal judge's credentials in the glove box, and he definitely didn't see the high-definition dashcam capturing his every move. Reynolds was about to plant a bag of white powder that would cost him his badge, his freedom, and a staggering $38 million. This isn't just a story of a crooked cop, it's the moment absolute power met absolute justice. Before we dive into this incredible pursuit of justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into the cases that changed the legal system. If you believe no one is above the law, smash that like button right now. The clock in the patrol cruiser read 10:45 p.m. as Reynolds scanned the affluent, old money streets of North Fairview. He hated this quiet beat, having been rotated here after a complaint regarding excessive force. When a sleek Mercedes-Benz S-Class swept past, Reynolds didn't care about probable cause. He cared about the thrill. He pulled out behind the car, running the plates and deciding the narrative was already written. A black man in an expensive car in this neighborhood didn't fit his worldview. Inside the Mercedes, Judge Nathaniel Rivers was exhausted after presiding over a grueling 6-week racketeering trial. Though he was driving exactly the speed limit, he saw the red and blue strobe lights erupt behind him. He pulled over smoothly and lowered all 4 windows, a habit born of necessity and survival. Reynolds swaggered to the window, shining his flashlight directly into the judge's eyes. Ignoring Nathaniel's calm greeting, the officer barked for his license and registration. As Nathaniel reached for his documents, Reynolds leaned in, taking a theatrical sniff of the air. There was only the scent of new leather and expensive cologne, but Reynolds lied anyway, using his go-to line to bypass the Fourth Amendment. "Smell a little weed in here, buddy." The flashing overheads reflected in the rearview mirror, casting a rhythmic, jagged crimson across Judge Elijah Cole's face. He didn't pull over immediately. He waited until he found a well-lit patch of shoulder under a street lamp. He knew the physics of these encounters. Ambiguity was a predator's best friend, and Elijah intended to keep everything in high definition. Officer Brock Reynolds, or Hargrove, as his shiftmates sometimes called him when he was playing the role of the tough guy enforcer, stepped out of his cruiser. He adjusted his duty belt, the leather creaking in the silent night, and took a slow, intentional breath. To Reynolds, this Mercedes wasn't just a vehicle, it was an affront. It represented a level of success he believed belonged to a different demographic. He approached the driver's side, not from the front, but from the rear quarter panel, staying in the blind spot to maximize the driver's anxiety. He tapped the glass with a heavy metal flashlight. Clack, clack. Elijah lowered the window. The humid night air rushed in, but it was colder than the atmosphere inside the cabin. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Reynolds barked. He didn't lead with a greeting. He led with a command. Elijah kept his hands visible, gripped firmly at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel. "Good evening, officer. May I ask the reason for the stop?" Reynolds flicked his high-powered LED beam directly into Elijah's retinas, momentarily washing out the world in a blinding white haze. "I'll ask the questions. You just provide the paper. Now." Elijah reached slowly for the glove box, his movements deliberate and telegraphed. "I am reaching for my documents now, officer." As Elijah handed over the leather-bound folder, Reynolds didn't even look at the name on the ID. He was too busy performing a visual sweep of the interior, looking for a crack in the armor, a stray seed, a torn plastic baggie, anything he could use to escalate. Finding nothing but the scent of expensive leather and the faint citrus of a car air freshener, Reynolds leaned closer, his chest GoPro camera angled toward the floorboards. "You're coming from where tonight?" Reynolds asked, his voice dropping into a low, predatory gravel. "The federal courthouse," Elijah replied evenly. "It was a late session." Reynolds let out a sharp, mocking huff of a laugh. "The courthouse? Doing what?" "Cleaning the floors." Elijah's expression didn't flicker. "Presiding over a trial." The silence that followed was heavy. Reynolds stiffened, his ego bristling at the implication. He didn't believe it, or rather, his bias wouldn't let him. He needed a pivot. He needed a way to reclaim the high ground of the hunter. He pulled his head back from the window and took a long, exaggerated sniff of the air. He looked left, then right, as if searching for a ghost. "You know what, Judge?" Reynolds said, the sarcasm dripping like acid. "I'm picking up a very distinct odor coming from this cabin. Smells like burnt marijuana. A lot of it." Elijah's grip on the wheel didn't tighten, but his eyes narrowed. He knew the script. The fake suspicion was the universal key used to unlock doors the Constitution usually kept shut. "There is no contraband in this vehicle, officer," Elijah said, his voice dropping into the resonant, authoritative tone that usually commanded a courtroom. "Step out of the car," Reynolds commanded, his hand moving to the holster of his taser. "Now, before I have to assist you." The heavy door of the Mercedes clicked shut with a finality that felt like a trap springing. Judge Elijah Cole stood on the asphalt, the humid night air pressing against his skin. He stood perfectly still, feet spread shoulder-width apart, hands raised and open, a posture of total compliance that masked a mind recording every micro-movement of the man in front of him. "Turn around. Interlace your fingers behind your head," Reynolds barked. Elijah obeyed. He felt the rough tug of the officer's hands as Reynolds performed a pat-down. It wasn't a search for weapons, it was a performance of dominance. Reynolds leaned in close, his breath hot against Elijah's ear. "You think that robe makes you untouchable? Out here, I'm the judge, the jury, and the executioner." Elijah didn't flinch. "I believe the Constitution might disagree with your jurisdiction, officer." "The Constitution doesn't have a badge." "I do," Reynolds sneered. He shoved Elijah toward the front of the cruiser. "Stay right there. Don't move a muscle while I verify your odor problem." Elijah watched through the rear window of his own car as Reynolds began the search. It was a chaotic, disrespectful ransacking. The officer tossed the leather-bound legal briefs onto the floorboards and ripped at the upholstery of the passenger seat. Then, the choreography changed. Reynolds' movements became fluid, practiced. He reached into his own tactical vest, his body angled to shield the view from the cruiser's dashboard camera. With a slick magician sleight of hand, he withdrew a small, clear plastic bindle filled with a white crystalline substance. He pressed it deep into the crevice of the center console, then pulled his hand back, pausing for a beat to count to 3. "Well, well, well," Reynolds called out, his voice pitched for the benefit of his body cam. "What do we have here? Looks like the Honorable Judge Cole has a bit of a chemical habit." He emerged from the car, holding the planted baggie aloft like a trophy. His face was a mask of mock disappointment and predatory triumph. "Crystal meth. That's a straight-to-jail felony, counselor. I guess the bench is going to be one seat short tomorrow." He marched toward Elijah, pulling his heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The ratcheting sound of the metal teeth biting into Elijah's wrists was the only noise on the silent street. "You are under arrest for possession of a controlled substance," Reynolds announced, his voice booming with newfound confidence. He was already imagining the look on his sergeant's face. He was already spending the invisible social capital this bust would bring him. He felt untouchable. Elijah Cole didn't struggle. He didn't yell. He didn't even protest his innocence. He simply turned his head to look Reynolds in the eye, his expression as unreadable as a marble statue. "Officer Reynolds," Elijah said softly, his voice vibrating with a calm that should have terrified the younger man. "I hope you've been as thorough with your own equipment tonight as you were with my car. Because once this process starts, there is no turning back for either of us." Reynolds just laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. He pushed the judge into the cramped, plastic-smelling back seat of the cruiser and slammed the door. He didn't realize that the red light blinking on the judge's rearview mirror wasn't a security alarm. It was the heartbeat of a high-definition witness that never slept. The iron gates of the central precinct hissed open, swallowing the cruiser into the fluorescent-lit bowels of the booking floor. Officer Reynolds killed the engine, the silence of the car replaced by the distant, rhythmic clank of cell doors and the muffled shouting of the holding pens. "End of the line, Your Honor," Reynolds mocked, throwing the car into park. He stepped out, his chest puffed with the adrenaline of a major bust. He walked to the rear door and hauled Elijah out by the arm, the judge's movement stiff but dignified despite the steel cinched around his wrists. Inside the intake area, the air smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Reynolds marched his prisoner toward the booking desk where Sergeant Miller, a 20-year veteran with eyes like clouded glass, sat behind a computer terminal. Got a live one, Sarge, Reynolds announced, dropping the plastic baggie of white crystals onto the counter with a triumphant click. Possession with intent. Caught him in a black S-Class over in North Fairview. Claims he's a judge. Miller didn't look up at first. He reached for the intake form, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Name. Elijah Cole, the judge said firmly. Miller's fingers froze. The name hung in the air like a live wire. The sergeant looked up, squinting through his bifocals at the man in the charcoal suit. He looked at the face, then at the silver hair, then back at the intake screen. A slow, cold realization began to bleed the color from Miller's weathered face. Reynolds, Miller whispered, his voice cracking. Where did you say you stopped him? Oak Creek. Why? He's probably some traffic court hack from out of state, Reynolds said, though a small icy needle of doubt pricked the back of his neck. Miller ignored him, standing up so abruptly his chair skidded against the linoleum. Sir? Judge Cole? From the Third Circuit. I am, Elijah replied, his voice echoing with the weight of a gavel. And I'd like to ensure that evidence bag is placed in a high-security locker immediately. It's going to be a very important piece of the upcoming federal investigation. The blood drained from Reynolds' head so fast he felt a momentary wave of vertigo. The Third Circuit. That wasn't traffic court. That was the federal bench. That was the man who oversaw the very racketeering cases Reynolds' own department handled. Sarge, wait, Reynolds stammered, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The smell, there was a clear odor of narcotics. I performed a legal search. I found the bag in the console. It was right there. Shut up, Brock, Miller hissed, his eyes darting toward the overhead security cameras. I'm telling you, it's a good bust. Reynolds' voice rose, bordering on a frantic whine. He could feel the walls of the precinct closing in. His mind raced, trying to remember if he had shielded the dashcam perfectly, if his body cam had caught the glint of the baggie in his palm before the find. He's lying. He's using his position to cover. I did everything by the book. Elijah Cole didn't look at the sergeant. He looked directly at Reynolds, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a smile that held no warmth, only the cold promise of the law. Officer, the judge said softly, the book you're referring to is about to be rewritten, and you're going to be the lead example in the chapter on career-ending mistakes. The holding cell was cold, but Judge Elijah Cole sat on the metal bench with the composure of a man in a high-backed leather chair. When the heavy door finally groaned open, it wasn't a public defender who stepped through. It was Marcus Thorne, a man whose legal fees were often compared to the GDP of small nations. Thorne dropped a pristine briefcase onto the bolted-down table, his sharp eyes scanning Elijah for any sign of cracking. Finding none, he leaned in. The superintendent is upstairs having a heart attack, Elijah. They're ready to drop the charges, offer a formal apology, and bury this before the morning papers hit the stands. Elijah looked at his lawyer, his voice a low, resonant hum. They want to treat this like a clerical error. A misunderstanding between a proactive officer and a prestigious citizen. Exactly, Thorne nodded. They'll throw Reynolds under the bus, suspension, maybe a transfer. But they want your signature on a non-disclosure agreement. Total silence in exchange for a clean record. Elijah leaned forward into the harsh light. No. If we take the apology now, the system stays exactly as it is. Reynolds becomes a bad apple instead of a symptom. I don't want a retraction, Marcus. I want a reckoning. Thorne frowned, tapping a gold pen against the table. It's your word against a decorated officer's body cam, which, coincidentally, glitched during the search. Without physical proof of the plant, a civil suit is a coin flip. Elijah reached into his pocket. He pulled out a slim, encrypted silver thumb drive he had retrieved from his personal effects during the brief moment he was unhandheld. He slid it across the scratched metal surface toward Thorne. What's this? Thorne asked. Reynolds was so focused on my skin and my car that he never looked at the rear-view mirror, Elijah said, a cold spark of triumph in his eyes. That Mercedes isn't stock. It's equipped with an integrated 360-degree surveillance suite, interior, exterior, and infrared. It doesn't just record, it uploads to a private cloud server in real time. Thorne plugged the drive into his tablet. The screen flickered to life. The footage was hauntingly clear. It showed Reynolds' face, illuminated by his own flashlight, as he pulled the plastic bindle from his vest. It showed the practiced, casual way he tucked it into the console. The audio was crisp. They could hear the officer humming a low tune as he framed a federal judge. Thorne let out a long, slow whistle. "This isn't just a defense, Elijah. This is a nuclear strike. We could end his career by lunchtime." "No," Elijah said, his voice dropping an octave. "We wait." Thorne looked up, surprised. "Wait? For what?" "For him to lie," Elijah replied. "I want him to file the sworn affidavit. I want him to testify under oath at the preliminary hearing. I want the police union to put out a statement defending his impeccable character. I want him to climb as high as possible on the ladder of his own deception." Elijah stood up, the shadow of the cell bars casting long, straight lines across his suit. "Because the higher he climbs, the more devastating the fall will be. We aren't just going after a badge, Marcus. We're going to bankrupt the culture that created him." The ink on the affidavit was still wet as Officer Brock Reynolds signed his name with a flourish of unearned confidence. In the quiet of the precinct's side office, the scratch of the pen sounded like a victory. He wasn't just filing a report, he was cementing a narrative. "Subject was observed operating a luxury vehicle in a suspicious manner," Reynolds wrote, his eyes narrowed in focus. "Upon making contact, a strong odor of burnt marijuana was detected. During a lawful search of the vehicle's center console, a clear plastic baggie containing a white crystalline substance, later field-tested positive for methamphetamine, was recovered." He didn't hesitate. To Reynolds, the truth was a flexible thing, easily bent to fit the shape of a badge. He knew the department's internal affairs would look at the glitch in his body cam with a sympathetic shrug. Equipment failed all the time. What mattered was the find. By the next morning, the story had leaked. The local police union, sensing a high-profile scalp, doubled down. A spokesperson stood before a sea of microphones, framed by the blue and white shields of the department. "Officer Reynolds is a decorated veteran of this force," the union rep declared, his voice booming with righteous indignation. "What we have here is a classic case of a powerful individual, a judge, no less, trying to use his title to escape the consequences of his criminal lifestyle. The law applies to everyone, even those who wear the robe. We stand behind Officer Reynolds 100%. Reynolds watched the broadcast from the break room, a smirk playing on his lips. He was the hero now, the Blue Knight who wasn't afraid to take down a corrupt elite. He began to believe his own lie, the adrenaline of fame masking the hollow rot of the crime he'd committed. However, beneath the surface of the public spectacle, the investigation was escalating in a way Reynolds couldn't see. While the local department was busy patting him on the back, a quiet storm was gathering at the federal level. Because the victim was a sitting federal judge, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit had been triggered. They didn't hold press conferences. They didn't talk to the union. They simply began subpoenaing the cloud server logs of the Mercedes-Benz telematics system. State investigators, pressured by the union, pushed for a preliminary hearing within the week. They wanted to crush Elijah Cole quickly, to make an example of him before his legal team could mount a complex defense. Reynolds was told to prepare his testimony. "Stick to the report, Brock," his captain told him, clapping him on the shoulder. "Just tell the truth, our truth. We've got your back." Reynolds nodded, his chest swelling. He felt untouchable, perched atop a mountain of his own making. He didn't realize that the mountain was made of sand, and the tide was already coming in. He had officially sworn to a lie on a government document. He had crossed the Rubicon, unaware that Judge Elijah Cole was waiting on the other side, holding the remote to the footage that would erase him. The news cycle moved with the predatory speed of a wildfire. By the third day following the arrest, the leaks from the department had evolved into a full-scale character assassination. It started with a headline in the local tabloid, "The High Life and the Low Road, Federal Judge's Secret Addiction?" Anonymous sources within the precinct began feeding the press a curated collection of half-truths. They whispered about odd behavior during the stop and claimed that Elijah's calm demeanor was actually a narcotic-induced stupor. An old, dismissed complaint from a disgruntled defendant in one of Elijah's previous cases was unearthed and presented as proof of a history of volatile temperament. On talk radio and social media, the public fractured along predictable lines. To some, Elijah was a tragic figure, another black man targeted by a broken system. To others, he was the ultimate hypocrite, a man who wore the robe by day and bought poison by night. The police union's digital defense fund for Reynolds surged, fueled by a narrative that portrayed the officer as a blue-collar hero being bullied by the judicial elite. Through it all, the pressure on the Third Circuit was immense. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, some demanding justice for Elijah, others holding signs that read, "No one is above the law." Inside his private study, Marcus Thorne paced the length of the Persian rug, his phone buzzing incessantly with demands for a statement. "Elijah, the optics are catastrophic. We're losing the room. If we don't release even a still frame of that footage, your reputation will be unsalvageable before we even get to the preliminary hearing. They're calling for your resignation." Elijah sat by the window, a glass of water untouched on the side table. He watched the flickering lights of the news vans parked at the end of his driveway. "Let them call for it," he said, his voice a cool blade of stillness in the middle of the storm. "They are dragging your father's name into this now," Thorne pressed, his voice rising. "They're questioning every ruling you've made in the last decade. Why are we letting them build this bonfire?" "Because, Marcus, a bonfire needs a lot of fuel to burn bright," Elijah replied, finally turning to look at his attorney. "The more they scream, the more certain they feel. The more the union leaders put their faces on camera to vouch for Reynolds' integrity, the more they tie their own nooses. I want the entire department to sign their names to this lie. I want the public's outrage to reach a fever pitch." He stood up, his silhouette tall and imposing against the glass. "If we stop them now, we only save myself. But if we let this reach the summit, when the truth comes out, it won't just exonerate me. It will incinerate the credibility of every person who took a swing at me. We aren't defending a case, Marcus. We are conducting a funeral for a culture of corruption." Elijah's phone chimed. It was an alert. The district attorney had officially scheduled the preliminary hearing for Friday morning. They were moving fast, smelling blood in the water. "Friday," Elijah whispered. "The day the hunter becomes the trophy." The air in courtroom 4B was thick with the scent of old paper and the electric charge of a public execution. Every bench was packed, reporters, union reps, and the morbidly curious sat shoulder to shoulder. At the center of the storm sat Elijah Cole, motionless, his hands folded on the defense table like a man waiting for a symphony to begin. Officer Brock Reynolds was the star witness. He walked to the stand with a chin-high stride, his uniform pressed so sharply it looked like armor. He took the oath, swearing on a Bible with a hand that didn't tremble. "Officer Reynolds," the district attorney began, "walk us through the night of the stop." Reynolds leaned into the microphone, his voice a perfect pitch of professional concern. "I observed a vehicle traveling erratically on Oak Creek Boulevard. Upon making contact with the driver, Mr. Cole, I immediately smelled a pungent odor of burnt marijuana. He was uncooperative, citing his status to intimidate me." Reynolds paused for dramatic effect, glancing at the gallery. "During a search of the vehicle for the source of the odor, I discovered a clear plastic baggie containing what was later confirmed to be methamphetamine hidden in the center console." "And you are certain, beyond any doubt, that this substance was found inside the vehicle at the time of the stop?" "Absolutely," Reynolds said, locking eyes with Elijah. "I found it myself. It didn't belong to the department, and it certainly didn't belong to me." Marcus Thorne stood up. He didn't approach the witness. He stayed behind the table, his fingers hovering over a laptop. "Officer Reynolds, you've testified that your body camera suffered a technical malfunction during the search. Is that correct?" "That's right," Reynolds replied smoothly. "Equipment fails. The truth doesn't." "I couldn't agree more," Thorne said. He pressed a key. "Your Honor, the defense would like to present Exhibit A. It's a 360-degree high-definition recording from the vehicle's internal security suite, a system that uploads to a secure cloud in real time." The courtroom lights dimmed. A massive monitor hummed to life. The silence that followed was visceral. On the screen, the perspective was from the Mercedes rearview mirror, looking back into the cabin with infrared clarity. The gallery watched as Reynolds leaned into the empty car. They watched his eyes dart toward the cruiser. Then they saw it, the glint of plastic in his palm, the deliberate shove of his hand into the console, and the smug, satisfied look on his face as he pulled his hand back empty. The audio was even worse. "Gotcha, you arrogant piece of—" Reynolds' voice echoed through the speakers, crystal clear and brimming with malice. In the witness box, Reynolds' armor vanished. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked at the screen, then at his captain in the front row, then back at the screen. The Blue Knight was gone. In his place was a man caught in a lie that had no exit. "Officer Reynolds," Thorne's voice was a low thunder. "Since you've just sworn under oath that you found those drugs in that car, and we can all clearly see you putting them there, would you like to tell the court which version of the truth we should believe?" The judge on the bench didn't wait for an answer. She leaned forward, her face twisted in a mask of cold fury. "Bailiffs," she commanded, the word cutting through the stunned silence like a guillotine. "Take Officer Reynolds into custody. Now." As the handcuffs clicked onto Reynolds' wrists, the very pair he had used on Elijah, the judge didn't look away. He watched the man who tried to bury him be led away in the dark, the first of many dominoes finally beginning to fall. The courtroom, which only moments ago had been the stage for Reynolds' arrogance, transformed into a theater of absolute accountability. As the bailiffs closed the distance, the click of the handcuffs echoed like a gavel strike against the silent gallery. Brock Reynolds didn't struggle. The weight of the digital evidence had seemingly turned his limbs to lead. The subsequent trial was not the swift, quiet affair the police union had hoped for. With the nuclear dashcam footage as the catalyst, the Department of Justice opened a floodgate. The FBI's Public Corruption Unit didn't just look at the night of Elijah Cole's arrest. They looked at the previous 10 years of Reynolds' career. What they found was a graveyard of fabricated probable cause. One by one, the other victims took the stand. There was a young college student who had lost his scholarship after a suspicious bag of pills was found in his glove box during a stop by Reynolds. There was a father of 3 who had spent 2 years in state prison because of a smell of marijuana that Reynolds had sworn under oath was present. As these men and women spoke, the camera caught Reynolds in the dock. He no longer looked like a Blue Knight. Shorn of his uniform and his authority, he looked small, a petty predator who had finally been snared by a bigger truth. The prosecution presented a pattern of predatory policing that targeted specific demographics to pad arrest quotas and satisfy a personal bias. The defense's argument of one mistake crumbled under the weight of 15 different testimonies. On the day of the sentencing, the courtroom was packed with the very people Reynolds had once looked down upon. Judge Elijah Cole sat in the front row, not as a victim, but as a silent observer of the law's ultimate function. The presiding judge, a woman known for her unwavering adherence to the sentencing guidelines, didn't mince words. "Officer Reynolds," she began, her voice cold and resonant, "you didn't just plant drugs. You planted seeds of distrust in the very soil of our democracy. You weaponized the badge to destroy lives, banking on the silence of your peers and the vulnerability of your targets. You thought the law was a tool for your ego. Today, the law is a mirror." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "For the counts of perjury, official misconduct, and the planting of evidence, I sentence you to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Furthermore, your name will be entered into the National Registry of Decertified Officers. You will never hold a position of public trust again." As Reynolds was led out through the side door, the silence in the room was finally broken by a single collective exhale. He was headed to a cell block where many of the men he had wrongfully arrested were still serving time. Elijah Cole stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. The criminal trial was over, but the reckoning was only beginning. The $38 million civil suit was looming, and the discovery process was about to turn the entire department inside out. Brock Reynolds had tried to end a career. Instead, he had started a revolution. The civil judgment didn't just break the bank, it broke the system. When the jury returned with the figure, $38 million in compensatory and punitive damages, the courtroom gasped, but Elijah Cole remained as stoic as the day of his arrest. The city's insurance plummeted, the police union's coffers were drained, and the department was forced into a federal oversight program that stripped away the qualified immunity Brock Reynolds had once hidden behind. But for Elijah, the money was never the destination. It was the fuel. 6 months after the check cleared, A new glass and steel edifice rose in the heart of the city. It wasn't a private law firm or a boutique consultancy. It was the Reynolds Center for Judicial Integrity. Elijah had used every cent of the judgment to build a legal defense empire dedicated to one thing: providing high-level representation and advanced surveillance technology to those targeted by predatory policing. He hired the hungriest civil rights attorneys in the country and equipped thousands of low-income drivers with the same cloud-integrated dashcam systems that had saved his own life. The irony was a jagged pill the city was forced to swallow. Every time a corrupt stop was thwarted, every time a planted piece of evidence was exposed by the center's investigators, the name Reynolds was cited in the victory. The officer who had tried to erase a man's future had inadvertently funded the protection of thousands. 10 years later, the Elijah Cole Act had become federal law, mandating 360-degree, tamper-proof surveillance in every patrol car in the country. The Reynolds Center had exonerated over 400 innocent people and shuttered 3 precincts found guilty of systemic bias. In a state penitentiary 300 miles away, Brock Reynolds sat in the common room, his hair now a thin, brittle gray. He stared at the television bolted to the wall. A news segment was celebrating the anniversary of a landmark case. A young man, a student who had been cleared of a false drug charge, stood in front of the glass and steel building. "I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the Reynolds Center," the boy said into the camera, a bright, hopeful smile on his face. "The Reynolds name stands for justice." Brock flinched as if he'd been struck. He looked down at his faded jumpsuit, the name Reynolds stenciled in block letters over his heart. To the world, his name no longer belonged to him. He had wanted to be a legend of the thin blue line, a man feared and respected for his iron fist. Instead, he had become a brand for the very movement that dismantled everything he stood for. Back in his study, Judge Elijah Cole, now retired from the bench, poured a glass of aged scotch. He didn't hate Brock Reynolds anymore. Hate required an emotional investment he wasn't willing to make. Reynolds was simply a catalyst, a necessary friction that had sparked a fire of reform. He raised his glass toward the window, the city lights reflecting in the amber liquid. "To you, Brock," Elijah whispered to the quiet room. "You finally served the public. You protected and you served, whether you wanted to or not." He took a sip and turned off the lamp. The room went dark, but outside, the world was a little bit brighter. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been built to last.